Hi everybody, welcome back. We're now looking at the Baroque era in Holland. So we're going a little bit north of where we were in our last lecture on Flint. So very different culture and a very different type of clientele for art is going to emerge here for us. Already knew before you took the course, the name really to watch out for the most, I think, is going to be Rembrandt. We'll take a look at one of his remarkable self-portraits. Also a painting commonly known as the Night Watch, the proper name of which is the Company of Captain Banningcock, and we'll take a look at that. I definitely want to start off, though, with a little reminder about how this whole territory begins to change. We talked about the fact that Spain had control of the Low until about 1648, and around this point the United Provinces, what we refer to as Holland, broke free. So they become Protestant, and the southern half remains under the influence of the Spanish court. They remain in the Catholic tradition. So the absolute final act of establishing their independence from Spain happens 1648. So you've got Spanish Netherlands, and you've got what becomes the United Provinces, the Northern Netherlands, or what we now refer to as Holland. And there are really incredible paintings to be seen from this culture, and we could spend the rest of the semester looking just at the detail in the still life paintings. We won't do that, but I think it's really important for us to take a moment to acknowledge the level of skill and the incredible amount of detail. Part of that, I suppose, is owed to the artists of the Renaissance. The northern tradition in the Renaissance was poured detail on a small scale, and the use of oil paint and thin glazes. We can see that being continued here, of course. But this is a subject very unusual in most of the other cultures we've studied so far. The only still life that we spent any time with was that little basket of fruit by Caravaggio, and then we mentioning how it was in a lot of other paintings of his, and that particular basket of fruit did this. Didn't it hang over the edge of a table, cast a shadow into our space? So there is a bit of a connection to what Caravaggio is about here, but I talked a lot so far about the Baroque being an appeal to your senses, and this image has all kinds of appeal to our sense of taste, smell, the idea of liquids and foods to eat and fine objects to have. There's a snuff box there. There's all kinds of kind of luxury items on display. Broken glass. If you look right here, you can see the edges of that glass broken. So there's the implication of the need to have nice things and to indulge your senses, especially taste and smell. But there's also the implication of fragility in some of those objects. The paintings themselves are pretty remarkable to see in person because they feel almost impossible. They're so photographically real. Just look at in this wine glass, and you just can't quite get your head around the fact that it is in fact a painting by the hands of a human being. Know that some artists throughout the Renaissance had access to called the camera obscura, which is essentially a box with a opening in it, through which light would pass and project an image of what was outside the box on the inside back wall of the box. For making a camera, we know that artists had access to these types of visual aids, but before you decide that every Dutch painter is just tracing things, I did spend one summer trying to make very quote-unquote realistic painting, taking photographs, projecting them, tracing, and trying to replicate, and it was a terrible disaster on my part. I was not able to do it, and I had spent most of the student mocking people for using any kind of visual aid like that. I have learned my lesson, so I urge you to think about incredible skill that you're seeing on display here. Whether or not there was slight assist, this is a remarkable accomplishment. But beyond the technique is the importance of what these things mean, because they're really kind of odd. They're not religious paintings. And they're not genres. In fact, there's no people, right? There's no story happening at all in some respects. But what is displayed are the goods that have been obtained, collected, purchased, becoming upwardly mobile, rapidly upwardly mobile middle class. They're luxury goods. And the Dutch, in particular, you may be familiar with the Dutch trading companies, some of which helped found colonies in what becomes America on this continent. So when you think of the Dutch, think of them as having an extreme interest in trade and shipping. And one of the things that the paintings in this category are all about is kind of casing wealth and luxury, not in an egotistical or greedy, horrific kind of way. In fact, the paintings very often have a very moral center, and what they are trying to remind us is that in a very Protestant way, they're trying to remind us that God wants us to prosper, to do well, and to succeed and improve our lives, but not at the cost of overindulgence or sin or losing our souls. So we that symbolism, Mr. B, you're making this up. Well, look at things like this. The peeled piece of exotic fruit, this lemon, you find that a lemon peeled like that is going to go bad and dry out really quickly. And that's true of almost everything you see there. A piece of bread broken open and exposed to air is going to become stale very quickly. So there's a suggestion of passage of time, and that's very much at the heart of what these types of still lifes are all about. This was unfortunate that it has text all over it, but it was the best scan I could get, so you could see some up-close detail on this particular painting. But that is the highest resolution scan I could steal from the web, and it kind of loses some color and detail, don't you think? But it gives you a sense, again, lemon and some of the broken bread. You start to get a sense that these paintings are showcasing the goods that people were able to obtain and the celebration of their lives, but also the reminder that those lives are brief. Here's another example by Heda that has that same lemon theme in it. They're just astonishing accomplishments. So the Heda piece to know from the textbook is this one. It is life with oysters, rum glass, and silver cup. Pretty easy to recognize because all the things in the title are in the image. And you see, of course, again, that lemon, that idea of fruit about to go bad. In this one, we also have the broken cup to remind us of fragility. There are lots of paintings in this kind of story, so I'll go fairly quickly through some of these others. But I did want you to see that there are lots of artists doing them. It's not just one person. There was a whole industry for this. And some of them, as in the painting by Peter Claes, especially the image at the lower right, go even a little further than Heda's paintings we've seen so far, reminding us about morality. So again, you see a memento mori, right? A reminder, a very, very on point one. There is skull there, and it seems jarring in comparison with all the other nice things around it. Beautiful glass for drinking rum, ashtray. They didn't know how bad smoking was for you, but still the idea of poetry and writing, all these wonderful things for the senses, and then death, right? So the idea of a vanitas becomes really important for us. Vanitas is an implication of doing something in vain, and you probably know that expression. To do something in vain, it won't succeed, or there's no positive outcome, there's no point. Taking a test if you hadn't studied at all would be doing something in vain, right? The Vanitas still life is about that type of idea of things in vain. It's a vain idea, not about your own personal appearance. It's a vain idea to think that you will live forever, stay young and fit and healthy with no problems, and sweeter as you go. Those are kind of immature ideas, and that's really what Vanitas is about. It's to remind you, yes, life is wonderful and beautiful, and you should enjoy it. Eat the cookie, have a wonderful experience in your relationships with people, but also don't indulge so much in all the sins because life is super brief and you don't want to risk your soul. That's the whole theme of the Vanitas. So yeah, there's lots of luxury items there, and there's lots of images in these. These are by Willem Kalf. The paintings do definitely reference the idea of exotic goods traded for all over the world, and the Dutch had vast trading empire, and they in fact became to have a stock market. So I mean, these were people who were very aware of healthy economy and what it takes to grow wealth and to build an upwardly mobile middle class. So yeah, they're showing off a bit, but they're also reminding themselves not to show too much. I wanted you to see the work of Clara Peters. This is a pretty remarkable painting. To think women are becoming more prominent in the arts, it happened in Holland. Women could really make substantial careers as painters of specifically still life, especially these Vanitas subjects. Flowers appear in the Vanitas subjects a lot because, of course, the minute a flower is cut, it starts to die. So it's a perfect symbol for the beauty and fragility of life. But check out how much detail Clara Peters is able to get into this piece. Oh my goodness, you can see her self-portrait in the reflection. If I back it up, we're looking at these convex surfaces. How remarkable is that? And again, as a female painter, she's showing you her work. We don't see that as much with male self-portraits. Really remarkable. Eva Oostervik is another artist in the same Vanitas, and her images, a lot of them include not only flowers that are being devoured by insects, right? They're at their peak of beauty, about to go bad, but you notice that her paintings include tulips as well as outright memento mori. The tulips themselves are, of course, a symbol of Holland. And it's also interesting to note that the first stock market crash in Holland was brought about by over-speculation in the tulip market. Expecting the production of an enormous number of tulip bulbs, and then a terribly hard winter happened and killed bulbs, and so people who had invested in the tulip businesses lost an enormous amount of money because they were not able to produce the good. So it's kind of odd that a flower could bring about economic ruin for someone, but it had that kind of power. These are works by John Davids de Heem and Rachel Rausch, tulips, and the same kind of insect theme of devouring something beautiful at the peak of its beauty. It is awesome to think that in this Protestant and upwardly mobile culture, the doorway of art is being opened more to people other than just men. It's really kind of remarkable to think about how many women are succeeding as artists in this period. And is there any question why? Because they were so freaking talented. Those insects are just remarkable. So the next big topic for us then is what other painting and selling, and that of course would be the portrait. So in Dutch culture, it was very important for there to be sort of a participation in public life. And if you were someone of means and status, it would not be unusual for you to serve your community in some kind of public way. And so there were definitely these types of militia groups, service groups, would help with the issues of homelessness or elder care. In this case, we're looking at a civic guard. And so these members of this group are recording themselves as active participants in the protection and prospering of their own city. They're also being paid a bit of homage by how much money they have paid to be included in the painting. So obviously the leaders are going to, but the supporting figures quite often were sort of ranked in how much space they would occupy in the painting based on how much they paid the artist for the work. So this is the work of Frans Hals, who's probably the best known of these group portrait painters. The one to know for the test is this icon piece of his that feature a women's social justice group. This is the women regents of the old men's home at Haarlem. So they are a little less jolly than the men that you just saw, but they are definitely keeping the moral center of their culture and trying to navigate the difficulties of age and of elder care. You definitely see in their that they are doing what is morally right. You can feel that from space. Also did interesting kind of genre portraits. They're not specific, represent more almost, I don't want to say stereotypes, but kind of iconic characters. My favorite is the contrast between the character and the young boys playing music. The idea of the witch is really not so much that she's casting spells. It's sort of a better definition, my crone. She is the elderly, wise woman, and you can see that she's associated with the owl we associate with wisdom, but also with a big tankard of ale. Artemisia Gentileschi we talked about in Italy. I did not show you this portrait at the time, but this is her self-portrait. In the act of painting, she's proving to you that she can do it. And that continues here in Holland. Check out the painting at the left. That's a self-portrait by a female painter, Judith Leister. And Leister is showing you the type of work that she's known for. She literally shows you herself doing, very known for these kind of allegorical scenes that were meant to appeal to your senses, particularly the sense of sound through music. You can see she's prosperous and successful in the way she's presented herself, and the reason she is, look at the portrait or genre allegory on the right. That image of the boy playing the musical instruments, boy playing a flute with instruments behind him, almost looks photographically real. She is an skilled painter, which brings us to a really interesting point. If there are female artists, how come we don't know about them so much? Well, for one, with training and they didn't have as much access to the commissions. But another issue comes up in that over time, objects are not always in meticulous condition or kept good records of. So this painting that you see here at the bottom of the screen, right to the left of it included the actual signature and date. And that signature is definitely Judith Leister's signature. And we know this because her father owned a pub, and the pub's symbol was the star. So she used that as the symbol for her L. That's her J with the star. That's her name. Well, that area in the painting had become covered with grime over time. Now, that sounds impossible, but if you think that paintings quite often are varnished to brighten their colors, and the varnishes, until they dry, are quite sticky, and any painting that's exposed to the air that has a somewhat sticky surface will start to collect those particles. So a painting in a building that has no electric light, the only light source is going to have to be burning candles or oil lamps. So paintings definitely can accrue a surface of what happened to this painting. Her signature got covered up. The record of who painted it had become lost. It was just a random masterpiece from the Dutch Baroque. It was sold at auction, and when it was purchased, the museum that purchased it cleaned it and discovered Judith Leister's signature. But they had purchased it believing it to be a painting by Frans Hals. And so they demanded a refund, and they got it. Even though the painting hadn't changed, they still thought it was this masterpiece. But because it was a masterpiece by a less famous artist, it was suddenly worth less. Can you believe that? This is, I think, every bit as good, if not better, than the work that Frans Hals was capable of. So it really is kind of a frustrating story to think about how art gets preserved and who gets to be part of the story. We definitely want to think about the artist. Rembrandt is perhaps one of the most influential and famous artists of the Baroque. And so he is an artist who had influence from other artists of his own culture. You can see paintings by people he trained with to the left, and then you can see his paintings he begins to sort of create his own story. He includes himself quite frequently in stories that are sometimes biblical. You see his self-portrait there as the prodigal son, and his wife actually appears as sort of a temptress to him. He also is very much someone to put the people in his daily life into his paintings. And so when his first wife dies, his became essentially his common law wife, and so you see her depicted there as well. So in a way, somewhat similar to Rubens, we have a man who is well versed in love and cares about his family. The sad part of the story, though, is that Rembrandt is not financially as successful as Rubens. He actually has some money troubles later in his life. So eventually he does have to file. Actually, a lot of his property is auctioned off. So it's kind of interesting to consider that Rembrandt now we consider to be one of the most treasured and influential artists of all time. But to think of him having a problem that we associate with money today is kind of an interesting thing to consider. This is one of his most famous and most beautiful portraits, Old Man with Gold Chain, and you can see him really taking on everything that was good about what Leonardo knew how to do and bringing it into now the 1600s. We're, upping 100 years away from some of Leonardo's works. One of his most famous pieces, and one of my favorites in a lot of ways, I wouldn't want to live with it, but Rembrandt's Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulp really does show how medical training was happening. And so Dr. Tulp commissions a portrait, but in a very Dutch way, does not have a portrait of him posing in his most expensive clothes in a fancy setting. He shows himself at work teaching young doctors about the workings of the human body by doing a dissection of a corpse. It is a remarkable subject and a window into what the Dutch art world was like, what their culture was like. Several subjects by Rembrandt that are really kind of gruesome, but are all about this anatomy study and the importance of bringing knowledge into the medical field. You see that here in this anatomy lesson as well. Just remarkable paintings. He definitely did not shy away from kind of grotesque things that he does of slaughterhouses, images of animals being butchered as well for sale for meat. He will have a massive influence into the 1900s and into the 21st century. On the left, you see Rembrandt's influence on American painter Thomas Eakins, and Eakins' painting from the 1800s, just after the Civil War, shows you a doctor who's a teacher in America performing an operation for his students to learn. So he's very much in the tradition of Dr. Tulp. You also see work from England by the artist Francis Bacon. He's obviously combining the flayed ox from Rembrandt with other imagery to create this emotional, expressive, abstract work of the mid-century. So Rembrandt is probably best known for much darker subjects in terms of and shadow than what we saw with Rubens, but that diagonal composition is pretty common to both of them. So this is Rembrandt's descent from the corpse. We see a lot of stories we've seen before: Sacrifice of Isaac, Writing on the Wall, Belshazzar's Feast, the figure of Danae. We saw Titian tackle this subject. Supper at Emmaus we've seen multiple times, but generally close up. We are getting a little bit more of a remove from Rembrandt. We're a little further back from some of these subjects. I definitely feel like that real people paint these, and look again at that open brushwork. He's clearly a fluid and facile painter, very adept. Making money from making group portraits, for sure. Rembrandt's Syndics of the Drapers Guild is one of his most celebrated group portraits. But the one to know for the test, obviously, is this one, Rembrandt's Company of Captain Bangkok. This had been called for a long time by its nickname, the Watch, again, because the painting needed cleaning. And once it was cleaned, it was determined that although it is a still relatively dark painting, look at the light that's across this figure here, we're actually in essentially a street with very tall buildings, so light is coming in on the cross this intersection. So we're actually seeing a daytime scene again of a civic guard, and it's one of the more dynamic of the portraits of all of the Dutch Baroque, and certainly in Rembrandt's work as well. There's a pretty awesome and a bit odd inclusion here. We think that there is a self-portrait, the face right behind the captain, it's sort of hidden just over his head, is believed to be a self himself. And we know that this particular guild had as its symbol a bird claw, a golden claw. And if you look really closely, the light is highlighting this odd female character, almost looks like an angel, but tied to her belt upside down is a chicken. It's the golden claw is right there. So it's a really clever inclusion of the symbolism. There's Rembrandt's head. Funny. So Rembrandt's subject matter quite often is very reverential of biblical stories. He returns to the story of the prodigal son again and again and again. And this, is, of course, is, you know, the young, foolish man who wastes his money and doesn't follow his father's advice, but still being taken to his father's home. Rembrandt's maybe most important contribution in some ways could be considered his remarkable series of self-portraits. Artists before him did quite so many, and maybe no one since has done quite so many self-portraits. So you could kind of argue a little bit, is he doing them? Is he some kind of egomaniac? Is it all because he thinks he's the best looking guy in the world, or what? In fact, I think that for a lot of artists, looking at yourself in a mirror is a lot cheaper than having to hire a model to try to hone your skills in terms of proportion, to deal with high shadow, contour, and practice for sure. But Rembrandt uses it really as an opportunity not only to record his own life, but to show himself in different emotional states, different costumes, almost as if he's playing roles of different characters like an actor. I love the drawing himself. That piece is so modern in its feeling. It almost looks like a drawing that comes from the 20th century, but that was his study for this. I get a chance to show you this kind of stuff in a textbook. This is one of the great things about taking a lecture class, is you get to delve in further than you in a handful of pages. He also did enormous numbers of prints, specifically etchings and engravings. So here's another self-portrait with intentionally surprised expression. It almost feels like he is playing different characters, don't you think? And you can, of course, see him aging from one to the next. This is him at age 34. He's older than one from 1658. He feels like a diplomat there, a very wealthy landowner. This is the one to know for the test. I think it's a great one. It's self-portrait with two circles. There very definitely are geometric forms in the background, which is kind of an odd compositional device, but it does draw your eye toward the center. And if you look closely, look how loosely painted the paintbrushes and so forth are. Now, you don't see the painting he's working on, which probably would have shown us, but we do get to see him holding the tools and dressed appropriately. He's not wearing his finest, fanciest outfits the way Velasquez was. I think it's interesting to see how he plays up these different emotional states and even mental states. He takes on different characteristics, and he almost uses himself as a actor to create this feeling of how to express human emotion and human frailty in different contexts by painting himself over and over and over again. It's a really astonishing accomplishment. Again, it's important to know about the fact that he did work in printmaking. He did work primarily also etching. The etchings are probably the most famous. With an etching, the basic way to think of this being done is with a copper plate, flat sheet of copper. covered in an acid-resistant, and then taking a very sharp needle and scratching, not the metal, but just the coating itself, almost like doing a scratch board. You're scratching the ground or the coating away, and then putting the plate in what we call an acid bath, a solution of acid and water. And the acid eats away at the plate. Then when we have timed it to the right level, we remove it from the acid bath, clean everything off, put ink, and that forces the ink down into the grooves that were made by the acid, and then we can print it onto paper and print it again and again and again. So Rembrandt is very well known for dark paintings and dark etchings. What you're seeing here is actually what we've referred to as a state of the etching. This would have been a test proof that he would have darkened in this next third and fourth step. So you can see that the figures on this shadow, more detail, that happens by etching again and again and again. So you would occasionally pull a print to see what the process was. He's well known for these etchings that get darker and darker and darker over time. You definitely want to know some of the older, some of the other artists, rather, that we refer to sometimes as the little, who were doing subjects that were not as important, perhaps, as the portraits, group portraits. We often see these landscape subjects coming up. And Jacob van Roosendael is one of the artists who really imbued his landscapes with much more emotion. This is the one you're seeing now, is the second version. Awesome. Roosendael's paintings very often, though, have very iconic Dutch symbols or examples of Dutch life. The windmill in particular. We have lots of genre painters in this period as well, and those genre paintings sometimes tell really funny stories. So the most famous of these is, of course, Jan Vermeer. Is well known as an artist who did make use of some optical devices like camera obscura, but again would paint so meticulously in perfect detail and replication of color and light and shadow that he painted really, really slowly. We know Vermeer had a really massive family, 15 children, 4 of whom died young, but that means 11 lived to adulthood. There's only about 40 paintings, and he did not live an incredibly long life, so he was finishing about 3 works every 2 years. Like what is that, a painting and a half a year? So you can imagine that he could have made a lot more money had he painted a bit faster, but he painted things that people would buy. He definitely painted things that were appealing to the Dutch culture at the time, and quite frequently you'll see his paintings from a lot of the paintings feature this window at the left-hand side, as if you're looking into the corner of a room. Some of them are of women doing household chores to do with food. Others are men. You can see clearly the same model used for both, but they're more, I guess, intellectual in and the geographer. And you can even see the same room being used again here for the concerts and music lessons. So he is showing kind of contemporary Dutch life in these paintings with meticulous detail. Personal favorite and one to know for the test is the one on the left, Vermeer's The Left. And in this painting, we're actually in that same room, probably, but now we're seeing it from inside of what looks like a closet, as if we're kind of peeking out at something we shouldn't be able to see. And it is the woman of the house being confronted by her maid, who's handed her a letter. And if you really look at the expression, who's getting the letter looks really worried, and the maid looks kind of triumphant. Behind the maid is a painting that symbolizes husband of the woman of the household, who is a Dutch trader. He's gone a lot. And the letter is meant to imply that he's coming home. He had told her he would. His return is imminent. And so the maid is essentially kind of symbolically calling her out for the affair that the maid knows she's been having. Who would know better than your household servant, right? And of course, the servant's not in a position she knows that the wife is going to be caught in this affair. And so there's an implication of morality, there's a little bit of humor to it. Also the implication that you need to be very careful about what you allow people to know about your life. You can see that very clearly. One of the most famous of his other paintings, of course, is Girl with Pearl Earring. You've seen that probably in multiple reproductions your whole life.